In October 1982, the Trashman, a 58-foot yacht, set sail from Maine on a routine trip along the east coast of America, bound for Florida with her new owner, a Texas tycoon. A ragtag crew of 5 embarked on what they believed would be 6 straightforward days on the Atlantic Sea. What they didn't realize was this supposedly simple journey would become a shark-infested nightmare. This incident is filled with so much horror on multiple levels. Truly a horrific tragedy. But before we dive in, I want to let you know that I make videos weekly. So if you want to see my next one, please drop the video a like and subscribe if you are new. It really helps me out. Thank you. 27-year-old John Limeth was the first of the delivery crew to be hired into post by the Trashman's new owner, Morris Neuberger. Born in Portland, John had already had an illustrious sailing career, having captained the famous Black Knight a few seasons prior. John thoroughly enjoyed a life on the sea and could frequently be seen drinking beer and smoking cigarettes on the deck, while taking in the scenery and enjoying the lifestyle that is synonymous with yachting. He had arranged to pick up his girlfriend, Meg Mooney, on the way to Florida. Meg would officially be joining the crew as a galley hand, despite having no prior experience of working on a ship. At 32 years old, Meg, born Margaret Wolfenberger, was more used to life in the air as opposed to the sea, having worked as a flight attendant and a fashion model since graduating college. Recently divorced, she was excited to join her new boyfriend on what she believed would be an exciting adventure. As the skipper of the ship, John had enlisted the help of seasoned young sailor, 24-year-old Deborah Kiley from Texas. At just 24, Deborah had become the first American woman to complete the Whitbread round-the-world race. A year later, she arranged to meet John at the Southwest Harbor Dock in Maine to report for work. He responded to an advert she placed at the dock, where she had been doing some casual work as a waitress, awaiting her next voyage. To her disgust, she had found him passed out below deck after a heavy drinking session. This would become commonplace in the 3 weeks they would spend docked and preparing for the trip along the coast. Deborah was a true professional and was less than impressed with John's laid-back approach to sailing and life in general, but nonetheless took the job and began to call around her fellow sailors to assemble a trustworthy crew. A resilient and hardy individual, Deborah had survived a tumultuous upbringing and an eating disorder, but came through these hardships stronger and with a determined and shrewd attitude. Soon after leaving the dock in Maine, John and Deborah picked up Meg and headed towards their first stop at Annapolis Harbor, Maryland. Deborah noticed John rarely easing the sails and heavily relying on the temperamental inboard monitor, which frequently cut out and caused issues. Her urgency to recruit a more reliable crew deepened. John's track record of captaincy eased her worries somewhat, but she still couldn't help worry that the trip ahead might be difficult with an inebriated captain and an unreliable monitor. While John and Meg refueled, Deborah called Sarah Kavanagh, a fellow star sailor who she had raced across the Atlantic a year prior. To her dismay, Sarah was unavailable, but in a twist of fate, Whilst heading back to the trash man, she ran into Sarah's brother, Brad, strolling along the dock with a friend. At only 21 years old, Brad Kavanagh lived what appeared to be a charmed life. Born into a rich family and attending elite schools in Massachusetts, he had taken up sailing, following in the footsteps of his older sister. In reality, Brad had come from a violent home where his father's alcoholism and abusive nature had left him feeling like he had something to prove. He was walking on the dock that day with his good friend and fellow boat racer, Englishman Mark Adams, a thrill seeker and a heavy drinker. Mark was the perfect fun-loving and spontaneous companion for a young Brad. They were both looking for work due to a sailing job that Mark had previously arranged falling through. John and Mark quickly formed a strong friendship, both enjoying drinking and smoking on the deck, while Meg lounged in the lower quarters. Brad and Deborah also built an instant rapport, the pair of them doing most of the work due to the intoxicated state of their crewmates. They shared their love for the sea and their enthusiasm for the boat, which at that point was a joy to ride due to the ideal conditions. Deborah and Mark were far from friendly with each other, but were content to avoid one another and take the running of the ship in shifts. What no one on board knew was that a storm was gathering. It was on the second night that the tentative peace of the newly formed crew was disturbed, and the inhabitants of the Trashman realised they were in trouble. Deborah had gone below deck after finishing her shift, leaving the reins in John's hands, but was woken a few hours later by his panicked voice. She could feel the boat being battered by the sea and could hear Meg screaming in pain. Meg had been thrown across the boat as it crested a wave and landed hard on her back. When Deborah got to her, Meg was in agony. Dark bruises were already forming on her back and around her kidneys. She was clearly in a lot of pain. Meg begged her boyfriend to take her home. John frantically searched his charts to try and plot a route back towards the coastline, but found that he didn't have the right charts for this area. Yet another bad omen on the voyage of the Trashman. It was also a black mark for the captain in the eyes of Brad, who was frequently growing frustrated with John's heavy drinking, poor forward planning, and inability to take control of the situation. John frantically radioed into the Coast Guard, while Brad and Deborah headed up to the deck to try and take control of the flailing ship. In the gusting 50-mile-per-hour wind, they found Mark clearly inebriated and howling into the wind, enjoying the raging storm despite the dangers, while Deborah and Brad tethered themselves to the deck and tried to steer the Trashman through the relentless storm. The Coast Guard advised John to take the boat into Wilmington, North Carolina. Unfortunately, this route was even more perilous, and the storm had already destroyed the vital navigation equipment. The waves smashed violently into the ship, continually knocking them off course and ripping off the ship's sails, breaking them entirely. John attempted to use the power of the engine to batter through the waves, but suddenly alarms and alert systems began beeping loudly and smoke bellowed from the onboard monitor. The engine was dead. Before long, the ship would run out of power and completely cut them off from anyone who may be able to send help. John used the last of the power to radio in for immediate rescue. His shouts of Mayday were met with disdain by the adrenaline junkie Mark, who saw it as a sign of failure and weakness. But John was desperate to get inexperienced Meg to safety. The Coast Guard issued orders to 2 nearby merchant ships to aid in the trashman's rescue. Feeling relieved, but also powerless without the assistance of the sails or the engine, Deborah and Brad, exhausted after fighting with the elements for 12 hours, clambered below deck to try and get some rest, believing help was on the way. Brad was unable to sleep, the battering of the waves on the boat filling his head with troubling thoughts. At one point, he felt the boat free-falling after cresting on a wave and crashing into the ocean below. The windows of the yacht smashed on impact and water began pouring in. He frantically woke his crewmates, the horror of the situation fully sinking in. The trashman was going down and there was no one there to help. They would have to evacuate in the middle of the night. The water was coming in quickly, nearly up to Deborah's neck by the time she managed to escape the lower quarters. Bleary-eyed from sleep, but wide awake in her panic, she saw the dark swirling sea surrounding them, aggressively batting the small boat from side to side and flooding it with water. Brad was on top of the cabin roof, struggling to free a rubber dinghy, while Mark worked to free a little raft from a plastic container. She watched as a pillar of water knocked them both into the sea, along with both the dinghy and the life raft. Mark didn't manage to keep hold of the life raft, and it flew out of reach, taking with it their best chance of survival, including flares, beaconing devices, water filtration systems, first aid kits, and rations. Deborah was then thrown into the sea herself. She thrashed underwater, trying desperately to get her bearings, and struggled through the icy cold depths back to surface. When she breached the water, she saw Meg covered in blood, clinging on to the rigging of the boat and screaming for help. She knew if she didn't save her, Meg's inexperience would kill her. She grabbed hold of Meg and dragged her towards the upturned rubber dinghy a few feet away. All 5 crew members thankfully made it to the dinghy and held on to the rope around the edges for dear life, as that too was wrenched and thrown violently by the stormy sea. The ropes burned their hands, and the ice-cold wind and water yanked them from all directions. They watched, horrified, as the trashman sunk rapidly into the black water. The dinghy was an 11.5-foot red and black Zodiac Mark II, and would become the new home for the crew of the trashman. Of a horrific setting, of a story of both gruesome death and grim determination. The group floated through the rest of the endless sea, wading water for 18 hours, still caught in the storm. They took it in turns, for each of them to clamber up onto the bottom of the upturned dinghy and rest. John didn't really acknowledge his fear, simply saying it's all over, while Mark, previously gleeful in the eye of the storm, screamed, "We are all going to die," over and over again. Brad was fueled by his fury at what he saw as Mark and John's multiple failures. All they had was a rubber dinghy with absolutely no supplies and the clothes on their back. Any help would have no way of being able to find them. At one point, after the sun had set on their first full day in the water, Meg spotted a light in the distance. The group were gripped with hope, but the reality was that they were far too small, and it was far too dark for anyone to notice them. The crew were doomed. After the initial shock and adrenaline had worn off, they began to feel the effects of the cold seeping into their bones. They decided to shelter underneath the dinghy and huddle together to share the warmth. Brad devised a piece of wire which would hold them up and out of the water, preserving heat and giving them the chance to rest. However, the air supply under the dinghy was limited, and John panicked. Ducking out of the makeshift shelter and complaining of pains in the chest, Meg begged the group to help him, so they decided to turn the dinghy the right way round, so that John could clamber back in. He was joined by an exhausted Meg and Brad. The true extent of Meg's injuries became obvious once she was out the water. The wires from the boat had caused a major laceration on her leg, exposing bone, her blood dripping from the gaping wound. Deborah and Mark stayed in the water, as the temperature there was a lot warmer than the air, a difference of about 20 degrees Celsius. They knew they needed to preserve their body heat as much as they could, but old angst reared its head as Mark accused Deborah of kicking him under the boat. The two had an argument, with Deborah insisting that she wasn't kicking Mark. She decided to dunk her head under the water to see where his legs were, and what she saw sent a jolt of pure panic through her, dousing her in fear. Through the salt water that stung her eyes, she saw at least 10 sharks circling below, seemingly attracted by the blood in the water from Meg's wound. She screamed in horror and jumped into the boat, closely followed by Mark. Within seconds, the dinghy was surrounded by shark fins, with the crew already battling hypothermia, dehydration, and starvation. A shark attack was now a very real possibility. Their chances of survival were diminishing rapidly. They huddled together to share body warmth and fend off the air chill. Deborah saw some seaweed floating nearby. With Brad's assistance, she quickly grabbed it out of the water to keep them warm. Dirt from the seaweed mixed with the blood, urine and seawater at the bottom of the boat. At this point, the crew was severely dehydrated and starving. The body can adapt to produce energy through alternative means during periods of starvation, potentially prolonging survival based on individual factors like body weight and genetics. But without water, the body undergoes significant changes. Brain functions are impaired, causing the victim to lose the ability to perform simple tasks and become easily irritable. They will develop headaches, dry, achy eyes, and itchy skin. Eventually, the body begins to take water from other organs, leading to organ failure and brain shrinkage. It's considered to be one of the most painful and prolonged deaths a human being can experience. The crew were also suffering with infections, painful, hot, swollen blisters, and sores on the skin caused by bacteria. Meg in particular was in a bad way due to her now septic wound, which was secreting pus and likely causing her to develop sepsis, a life-threatening reaction to the infection in her leg, which happens when the immune system starts to damage the body's own tissue and organs. She was noticeably weaker than the rest of the crew, her face pale and clammy, her speech slurred. The crew realised with a slow creeping horror that they were watching her die. Brad and Deborah huddled together as they looked at their crewmates and decided to form a survival partnership. They understood that without someone to have their back and pull them through, they were as good as dead. They placed their fate in each other's hands and agreed they would continue to live for as long as the other did, at any cost. By the third night, sharks continued to circle. They believed the Coast Guard would be out looking for them, as they hadn't docked after their Mayday signal, so they decided to settle down to sleep, in the hopes that the new day would bring with it new hope and some much needed medical attention for Meg. At some point in the night, Brad woke Deborah and gestured to the stern of the dinghy. "What do you think they're doing?" he said. 2 silhouettes could be seen leaning over the side of the boat and reaching into the dark water. Deborah realised with horror that John and Mark were scooping water out of the sea into their mouths. Along with the physical effects of dehydration, psychologically, the need for water becomes all-consuming. But drinking seawater is the antithesis of what an individual experiencing dehydration should do. Deborah and Brad knew this would prove fatal for Mark and John. Meg begged Brad to stop John, but he was too weak to intervene, stating that it was already too late. The first symptoms of John and Mark's deadly error could be seen by morning. "Let's just drive to the hospital in Falmouth, where my mom works," John said. "It's right over there." Despite the morning bringing with it a clear day and the first sighting of the sun since the Trashman sunk, John's mad ramblings cast a dark cloud. He was hallucinating and experiencing delirium. Mark followed quickly behind him, accusing the crew of stealing his cigarettes. "I just went to the 7-Eleven and bought cigarettes," he said, frantically searching the festering bottom of the dinghy. While Brad and Meg tried for hours to talk sense into the delusional men, Deborah closed her eyes to shut out the chilling babble. The words themselves were insane enough, but they represented the slow death of the men occurring right in front of their eyes. When she opened them, she seen John lowering himself into the water. "I'm going into the car," he said. "I know where the car is." Meg pulled herself up, despite the immense amount of pain she must have been in, and begged her boyfriend to get back in the raft, but it was too late. They watched the back of his head as he swam further and further away from the raft. They saw him disappear behind a wave, and then they heard a blood-curdling scream, which ended as abruptly as it began. The water turned crimson red with John's blood. He had been attacked and eaten by one of the circling sharks. Meg collapsed back into the boat, unable to do anything in her weakness other than simply state, "He's gone." Captain John Limmoth was dead, and the sharks in the water, a constant companion to the shipwrecked crew, finally had a taste of what they'd been waiting for. Mark's madness went in a decidedly more sinister direction after that, as he turned his attention to sickly Meg. "Hey lady," he said as he slid up to her in the dinghy. "Isn't it about time me and you had sex?" Meg was clearly in shock after witnessing the death of her boyfriend, and too weakened from blood poisoning to answer back. It was clear to everyone except delirious Mark that Meg would soon succumb to her wounds. Believing his advances to be spurned, Mark said, "I'm tired of playing games. I'm going to the 7-Eleven to get some cigarettes." And with that, he jumped out of the boat. Deborah and Mark pleaded with him to get back in, but before he got the chance, something struck the dinghy hard, and Mark was dragged below the surface of the water. What happens next is what can only be described as a feeding frenzy, directly underneath the dinghy, which pummeled the boat so hard that it spun around, forcing Meg, Brad and Deborah to huddle to the lowermost point. A scraping sound underneath the raft terrified everyone, forcing them to consider their worst nightmare: the slow hissing of a puncture, and then nothing to separate them from the bloodthirsty sharks below. Thankfully, it didn't come to that, and after time, the boat returned to the slow rocking of the sea. After the horror of the sharks and the deaths of Meg's boyfriend and Brad's good friend, the remaining 3 crew members' thoughts return to their aching thirst. Then, as the day turns to night, Meg's sickness takes an ominous turn. In the darkest part of the night, lit up only by a clear, starlit sky, Meg began growling and snarling. After being mainly incapacitated for most of their ordeal, she somehow was able to gather the strength to throw herself at Brad and begin to viciously attack him. Despite their frailty, it took Brad all of his strength to eventually throw her off him after a brief struggle. Recognizing that she was in the final stages of her life, Deborah tried to comfort Meg, who said in one of their last cognizant moments that she was going home. She began tracing shapes in the air and speaking unintelligible words. Deborah thought that she was speaking in tongues. She then moaned in agony for a while before falling into a fitful sleep. Her last words were, "I'm taking 3 souls and leaving you to tell." In the morning, Brad and Deborah discovered her body on the floor of the dinghy. Her skin was mottled and grey, and she was partially submerged in the putrid brown water, which sloshed over her face and body with the movement of the boat. Brad's stomach was hollow and starving as he turned to Deborah and suggested they should eat Meg's remains. Deborah considered the question before deciding that Meg's body was too infected to eat, saving her corpse from a gruesome fate. Brad and Deborah removed Meg's clothes for their own warmth, took off her jewellery to take home to her family, and said a prayer. They then put her gently in the sea and agreed that they would try to sleep to avoid having hear or watch her being eaten by the ever-present sharks. When they woke, Deborah became concerned with the water at the bottom of the boat. She believed it could contain diseases from Meg's body which could enter into their sores and cuts. The pair therefore agreed to do something incredibly dangerous, but which Deborah believed to be imperative. They would need to clean the dinghy out. Brad agreed to try and stood tugging on the wire to try and flip the boat, but he found he didn't have enough strength and instead flew backwards off the dinghy into the ocean. He panicked immediately, John's scream echoing in his ears as he grasped desperately for the boat. He knew he needed to urgently get back in or face death at the gnashing teeth of the sharks below. He was too weak to save himself. He begged Deborah to help him as he desperately clung to the side of the boat, but she didn't have the energy. All she could do was lay in the boat and weep. After what felt like hours on the verge of certain death, Brad was able to drag himself into the boat, unassisted. Although they were both alive, the survival partnership that had brought them this far was now dead in the water. They sat in silence at opposite sides of the boat, considering their mortality and fighting their own psychological battles, until Deb, look. At first, she thought he might have succumbed to madness, but as it turned out, she saw it, a huge freighter, heading right for them. It seemed to pass them by, and their hope sputtered into their chest. But then it altered its course, and they were saved. As soon as the crew of the freighter threw their life-saving equipment over the side of the ship, Deborah jumped into the sea, frantically swimming towards their saviors, Brad not far behind. When they were winched up onto the deck, they discovered their rescuers were a crew of a Russian cargo ship. They were found 140 miles away from where the yacht had originally gone down, and they were floating further out to sea. Back on land, life after the Trashman wasn't without its challenges. Brad and Deborah discovered that someone had called the Coast Guard to tell them the Trashman had docked safely, which was why the Coast Guard never came. A mystery that would haunt Brad for the rest of his life. He has spent decades since the accident trying to find answers, driving up and down the East Coast, stopping at bases, and trying to figure out how he and his crewmates could have been forgotten and left to die. Deborah would go on to become a motivational speaker and publish several books about her ordeal, but would be quoted as saying, "It was as if some part of me still lived, could only live on that raft, adrift at sea." She was married twice and had 2 children, but disaster struck again in 2009 when her son died tragically and ironically in a drowning accident at 23. Shortly after this, Deborah moved to Mexico, and it was then, 30 years after her heroic survival in the Atlantic, and nearly 3 years to the day since her son drowned, that she passed away at the young age of 54. There are various speculations on the internet, though the official cause of death has been kept private. The Trashman remains in its watery grave at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, as do the memories of Captain John Lippoff, Mark Adams and Meg Mooney. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay sane.